Hi, can I confirm that I'm visible and audible?
Yes, Nico.
And last confirmation that we can begin.
Yep, you can go ahead.
All right, so welcome everyone. I'm Nicholas from the Adjudication Core. Joining me are the organizing committee and the rest of the Adjudication Core. And we will be beginning our judge test discussion. So we will be discussing the following in this order. Firstly, we'll be talking about the objective test. We'll be going through each question, the answers to each question, and why these are the answers to each question. Afterwards, we'll be talking about the test debate, who won the round, our general comments, the oral adjudication, and then lastly, we'll be going over the members of the Shadow Adjudication Core and final reminders for judges prior to the tournament. So let's proceed with the first part, the objective test. Let's go to question number 1. The first question was as it's I don't think I will repeat word for word every question, but I'll do it for this one. If a speaker commits an equity violation in the round, that speaker's team automatically loses the debate. The correct answer here was false. While equity violations are abhorrent, and we as a community should be trying to reduce the frequency of these incidents as much as possible, judges still shouldn't take matters into their own hands and actively punish teams on the equity team's behalf. Simply put, or rather, it's preferable that we leverage the systems that the equity teams are putting into place to mitigate the impacts of these equity violations. It's not necessary anymore for judges to be actively punishing teams when these violations do take place. Rather, the course of action that should be taken is that judges should just disregard these arguments or these violations when coming to a decision. While it is not persuasive that an equity violation takes place, it's not persuasive at all for a team to be making these kinds of violations mid speech. They shouldn't be actively punished for it. What the judge should do, instead of interrupting the speaker, for example, in the middle of the speech, and forcing or automatically making them lose, is wait for the speaker to complete their speech and remind the debaters in between speeches to be mindful, for example, of their content, reminding them to introduce trigger warnings if there will be discussions surrounding sensitive topics, or being more cautious of the gender pronouns, for example, throughout the debate. Let's go to question number 2. Extensions can come in the form of new responses and new weighing. Absolutely. Extensions are any further analysis that contributes to the bench's position on the motion. There is no reason to believe that solely substantive arguments are the method by which the deputies can extend the debate. Framing and rebuttals might be more important, actually, depending on the situation of the debate, and deputies should not be punished for making the decision to prioritize framing and rebuttals as their extensive contribution throughout their speeches. Judges should not punish speakers or punish deputy speakers just because there's no new argument presented in their speech, because extensions can come in the form of new responses and new weighing. Let's go to question number 3. Whip speakers are allowed to launch new examples to existing arguments and new explanations regarding their prioritization of issues in the round. Yes, I'll now list the things that whip speakers are allowed to do. The whip speech can have new defenses of already existing arguments, new explanations of previously made arguments, new rebuttals, new examples to support existing arguments, and new explanations regarding the prioritization of arguments, or anything that the other side can reasonably expect because of something that was already discussed by the deputy speaker of that bench. What is not allowed are new arguments. Well, it does include, but it's not limited to. A way in which you can identify new arguments would be if the direction of the case is totally unpredictable or out of question. For example, if the motion was very, I don't know, this house would ban art, and the first speakers talk about its impact on a particular shareholder. If the whip speaker suddenly discusses economic benefits to the motion, that is an entirely new direction from the case. That is certainly a new argument and should be disregarded. However, if, for example, the whip speaker introduces new examples to analyze the shareholders that were identified in the first two speeches, these are things that are allowed to be done by the whip speech. Let's go to question number 4. Judges cannot determine the winner of the round based on the reply speeches. This is false. Judges can determine the winner based on reply speeches. The purpose of the reply speech is to fundamentally dissect and investigate the strategies or framing each bench introduces in the debate. Note that while both new arguments and new rebuttals are not allowed in reply speeches, it is entirely possible for these reply speeches to reframe or to re-emphasize to the adjudicator what should be prioritized in the debate, and these speeches can still be compelling to the judge for that reason, insofar as framing is still a crucial element in the debate used by all 8 speeches in an AP round to determine who is winning at any given point in time. Because the alternative really is, if it were true that reply speeches did not determine or could not assist in determining the winner of the round, why then are we really listening to reply speeches anyway? The truth is that they can be used, they can be leveraged, and therefore they must be listened to and paid very close attention to. Let's go to question number 5. Oh, sorry, there's like a mosquito in my room, and it's really annoying. Judges are allowed to discuss their decision with their panelists and sway other panelists to change their vote. This is not true in the AP format. So this would be true in British parliamentary, but if you were not informed up until now, PIDC will be using AP as its format, in which the adjudicators deliberate by themselves and submit the ballot by themselves. So what that means is when the debate concludes, and if you're a panel, for example, and the chair crosses the house and begins the deliberation period, you don't go with the chair and talk to them about the round. What you do is you on your own identify a range, you on your own identify a winner, and you submit this ballot. After you've announced that you've submitted your ballot to the chair, and the chair acknowledges that all members of the panel have submitted the ballot, the chair then finalizes with the decision whether or not it's a 2-1 split, a unanimous decision, and each panelist, including the chair, begins their oral adjudication one by one. So that's the process. It's not BP where the chair, after the round has concluded, has a meeting with the panelists where they ask each other questions to determine who won the round. That does not happen in AP. So it's false. Judges are not allowed to discuss their decision with their panelists and sway other panelists to change their vote. Let's go to the next question. Assuming there was no weighing, principal arguments are always more important than pragmatic arguments. This is not true. There is no kind of argument that is intrinsically preferable to other kinds of arguments. Principles are not intrinsically better than pragmatic arguments, nor are pragmatic arguments intrinsically better than principles. When comparing arguments of contrasting types or of contrasting nature, the adjudicator should leverage the weighing and framing performed by both teams to explain why their respective standards or arguments are the most compelling standards or arguments in the round. If no weighing is done at that point, what judges should then look at is the analysis provided, including but not limited to whether or not these arguments were logically demonstrated, whether or not they were granular and specific, whether or not they were comprehensive, whether or not they were sufficiently responded to by another team. All of these can be leveraged if absolutely no weighing is done. But the reality is that a judge should never go, a principal argument is more important than a pragmatic argument, or a pragmatic argument is more important than a principal argument, and therefore that on that basis I decided who won the round. That is not correct. It's always preferable to leverage weighing, framing, and analysis used by speakers rather than the types of arguments used by speakers. Let's go to the next question. The best speaker of the round must come from the winning team. This too is false. This is mostly actually a technicality, and there are too many reasons why this could be the case. So rather than going through them one by one, rather I'll just get straight to the point that we want to hammer down. Don't make the assumption that the best speaker is always in the winning team, or that the losing team must have worse speakers than the winning team. While it is true that the sum of scores of the winning team will always be greater than the sum of scores that the losing team gets, it's not out of question to give credit to the individual performance that you acknowledge to be compelling and give one particular speaker higher points than the entirety of the team in the opposition bench or in the opposing bench. Let's go to the next question. So I will mention that this was the question where the highest number of people got wrong. But to be fair, that may be because this had the most choices, so statistically that would be the case. But let me then still explain why this is the correct answer that you see right now. So the question goes, in this motion, government defines under full capacity as operating at a sales lower than full capacity. Opposition defines under full capacity to be the state of full capacity. and they accused government of squirreling the debate. So there were multiple choices, but the correct, I won't go through them anymore one by one. Just, I want to hammer down 2 points. Firstly, this is not a squirrel, so opposition is wrong to accuse government of a squirrel because government's definitions are reasonable with respect to the wording of the motion. Note a few things that came out in the judge test that I want to hammer down once again here. A squirrel is only a squirrel when the definition provided by government bench is so unreasonable that the motion becomes fundamentally undebatable. For example, if I define China as silverware, that is a squirrel because the motion becomes undebatable. If the motion, for example, was this House regrets China's presence in the South China Sea, if I said, well, silverware has been problematic in the sea, that clearly is undebatable and has totally gone away from the actual point of the motion. With that being said, judges should be cognizant that there is a difference between a preferred definition and an unreasonable definition. Take this motion for example. Just because the definition provided by government may not be what you had in mind because you had the same perspective as opposition that under is not a preposition, rather it's a state of being. That is to say, if you're under full capacity, you are at full capacity. If you're under arrest, you're in the state of arrest. So opposition could see the debate that way. And that's a fine definition. However, it would be wrong to suggest that government is being unreasonable when they define under to be a preposition of being below. So if I say I'm under a roof, it means I'm below a roof. If I say our margins were under the targets, it means the margins were lower than the targets. What is the implication of this? It means that even if you, the adjudicator, agree with opposition that they had a preferable perspective to the debate, because you have the self awareness to acknowledge that government's perspective on the debate wasn't unreasonable, that they arrived at that definition on fair grounds. It's unreasonable for opposition to say that government must have seen the debate in the same way the opposition did. Therefore, opposition is wrong to accuse government of a squirrel in this instance. But just as a disclaimer, rest assured that the Chief Adjudication Corps are working tirelessly to make sure that there is no motion this vague or that there's no motion that is open to this kind of competing interpretation. And so while these incidents have happened in the past and we are learning from these incidents, you don't rest assured that from us, we will do everything we can to make sure it doesn't happen in the debate. But at least now that if it does happen, I hope you are equipped with the knowledge to navigate these situations in your rooms. But there's one more thing I want to address before proceeding to the last question. A common observation was that a lot of people chose that government bench must defend both definitions in this instance. Let me explain why that is wrong. Government bench defending multiple definitions is permissible when they have a lacking definition. Let's use the example I gave earlier. This house would ban art. By the way, that's not a real motion. Like that's just for the sake of example. And this house would ban art motion. If government defines art to be movies, and then opposition says government is wrong when they only define art to be movies. Movies is also, oh sorry, art is also paintings. It's also sculptures. Then you're absolutely right. Government has to defend both definitions because their definition in government bench was inconclusive, and it's not mutually exclusive from the definition opposition presents. And opposition makes a compelling case to suggest that government does have to defend both definitions. However, the instance provided in this question is fundamentally different. Why? It's because government bench's definition, when compared to opposition, isn't a lacking definition. It is a diametrically opposed definition. It is not something that can coexist with opposition's definition. Because right now, government bench is saying their burden is to prove that operating below capacity is good. Opposition is suggesting to government that they have to defend operating above full capacity is good. So obviously, government can't do both because they are diametrically opposed with each other. And so it's unreasonable for the adjudicator in this instance to suggest that government bench has to defend both definitions because if they did, they would be constantly contradicting themselves. So what's the insight from this? When there are definitional challenges or definitional debates, these definitions, the cases can be between iterative iterative lackingness. That is to say, the first example, which is government wants to focus on some iterations, opposition wants to focus on other iterations. If opposition can prove that their iterations coexist with government benches, you're right. Government has to defend both definitions. The other instance is government has a totally different definition that cannot coexist with opposition's definition. In these instances, you don't go government has to defend both, opposition has to defend both. You go who was able to convince me that that definition was the best definition or the most reasonable definition in the round. Let's now go to the last question. So this is a long question. I won't anymore read through it word for word, but I will note again two insights. With regards to this question, the most important thing to note is that we asked which of the following is most true. And while we don't show it in this slide, all the choices except for this one would suggest that a certain team won over another team because of the exchange that the question is describing. Let me explain why those choices have a larger shadow of doubt with regards to their correctness as opposed to the correct answer we selected. The reason why those choices have a shadow of doubt over their correctness is that it is entirely possible for either government or opposition to still win the debate in spite of this exchange. For example, the judge could disagree with the deputy prime minister that their benefit is the most important. It could be entirely possible that this was just a one-liner or it was something that was asserted. For example, maybe there were other issues that were proven to be more important by the opposition bench, and therefore maybe their bench should be considered for these reasons. The point that I'm trying to get at here is that while it is possible that the other three choices could be the case, the fact of the matter is that for you to fairly arrive at that conclusion, you would have to make a series of assumptions that cannot be reliably made insofar as the information needed to make those assumptions are not provided whatsoever in the information given to you. On the other hand, the answer that is selected and the answer we have identified to be the correct answer is undeniably a contradiction. The first claim from opposition is that the benefit of cryptocurrencies is contingent on it being accessible. So when opposition whip says cryptocurrencies are not accessible in their response to the government bench, it is strongly limiting, or it has very strong tension with the claim made by the leader of opposition that it is widespread, because it cannot simultaneously be widespread and at the same time only affecting a few people. It can't be both. It has to be just one. And therefore, it's more true that opposition contradicted themselves as opposed to suggesting that anyone in government or opposition had won the debate already because of what this information suggests. That concludes the objective test. I'll be handing it over to the other members of the adjudication core for the test debate.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, Tony, you're audible.
Okay. So hello everyone. I'm Tony from the Adj core. So my task here today at tonight is to discuss the results of this test debate. Next slide, please. So essentially, the debate was clearly was clearly for government side. So they won the debate. Next slide, please. Oh yeah. In case people are not well appraised with it, the motion is this house would ban inheritance. Okay. So general comments first. Firstly, I felt that in the debate, there were two things that I felt could have better improved the debate. Firstly, in terms of mutual exclusivity of models, such that both houses had claimed that they had competing models. However, it wasn't really clarified to what extent are they so different from each other, and they're so different. Specifically, and this was more present in opposition side, wherein there were several claims that went against the model of government, but it wasn't really clarified on why their model is mutually exclusive to the harms they presented against their side. Conversely, I think also in government, it was also in later parts that was clear that for them it's the same thing. In the second general comment is that the impacts in terms of economic consequences, development of a narrative, and how actors are going to respond to that narrative were a bit speculative. By this, I mean that in an effort to argue how it's going to impact the economy, most arguments relied on a series of assumptions that were not adequately argued insofar as providing perhaps linear examples that provide how a specific model will lead to better economic consequences, for example. The second is the notion of a development of a narrative. It's can be the case that some houses, one bench, for example, argued that it will create a specific rhetoric or an anti-poor rhetoric, for example. That narrative, however, is ultimately reliant on it being built. So it wasn't really clear, for example, on how these narratives operated, and at the same time, how actors would respond to that narrative. I think that uh, one way to address these two concerns is to provide better weighing in the arguments, which I think was limited in terms of effort in both benches. Though there were attempts, especially in the latter speakers, I think it wasn't consequential such that it didn't. Um, most of the efforts to weigh were not really that important in terms of how the decision went that way. Okay, next slide, please. So what did we get from government? Government essentially argued for them, their model is to ban inheritance and use that inheritance to redistribute resources to social welfare to address social economic disparity. For them, social economic disparity is the problem. Social economic disparity for them is enabled by inheritance through intergenerational wealth and the prevailing economic, political economic structure. Inheritance for them is fictional. It is informed by history, birth lottery, and networks. For them, again, the state is better off insofar as accountability mechanisms are concerned. By this, it means that government argued that they would rather trust the state, or for them, in both worst case and best case scenarios, the state is preferable as an actor to initiate this policy, because at least even at the worst case, they can ensure there are accountability mechanisms such as, for example, voting. Opposition argued that the role of the state should not be to control the property of individuals. Instead, it should be able to facilitate agency. Their counter proposal is for a better progressive taxation and better labor laws. The react for them, the policy is harmful. And by this, I mean the banning of inheritance is harmful because there is a backlash from the rich to exploit the poor, because the policy will legitimize the notion of the poor as lazy. It was clear in both houses that in both benches, that socioeconomic disparity needs to be addressed and that the poor needs to be protected. So for them, the main problem is socioeconomic disparity and that the poor needs to be protected in both sides. It is implied that both benches agree on the role of the states, not necessarily on facilitating per se, but rather on, for them, the state having a crucial role in providing the policy in this debate. So for government, obviously, the actor that will initiate the banning of inheritance will be government, and then for the state, and for opposition, even as early as LO, they conceded that it's important at least to consider a scenario in the debate wherein the state is a good actor. So how did I weigh this? There were three issues. Next slide, please. So which model is more feasible, specifically banning inheritance versus progressive taxation? Is it principally justified? Will this stagnate the economy? Next issue. Next slide, please. Okay, so on the first issue, addressing socioeconomic disparity, feasibility of the model in addressing the problem. So this is essentially a debate. This issue is essentially about which bench was able to solve the problem relative to their model. So it was a debate of progressive taxation versus redistribution of inheritance. So Gov was able to argue on how inheritance enables wealth disparity through economic and political power. So they cited examples of nepotism, unfair historical advantage in wealth, how the rich are lucky to be there and therefore privileged to be in that position. Government, for example, further rebutted that on balance, acquisition of inheritance increases the resources that the state can redistribute. So this is referring to the argument of which model is better. So government were provided that at least when you have when you redistribute inheritance, it provides the state with greater resources to redistribute. Op responded that progressive taxation is preferable. And I think this is where the problem began, because banning inheritance for them is harmful because of a development of anti-poor narrative, which will result to exploitation. Government whip responded to this by arguing that it is symmetrical, such that in both sides, they're both going to harm the rich by removing resources from them. The only difference is the government will take resources away from them through wealth while they're living, while government will take the resources away at a point in time, they will the rich individuals die. So for them, government will provide an I think what a robust analysis on how the harms are symmetric. So this necessary. So what this did is essentially provided an analysis on how in both I needed opposition to argue to provide analysis on how their anti-poor narrative is not likely to happen on their side. Moreover, I also think it was also sufficiently responded as to how in both models their they follow a similar approach insofar as the state intervening and taking away resources from individuals um, to redistribute in the pursuit of removing socioeconomic disparity. So the justification is by focusing on responding against inheritance, OP was not able to build their case on how progressive taxation will work in solving the problem, how it is mutually exclusive, and how the harms they presented does not apply to their model. So the first issue therefore goes for government. Next slide, please. Okay. Is it principally justified? So government argued that inheritance is fictional, such that people working hard is not necessarily the main input in whether or not they're able to accumulate resources and wealth, but it is instead informed by intergenerational wealth, which enables political and economic opportunities for the rich to continuously acquire their wealth. For them, it's a multiplying factor, such that it enables them to access, for example, better resources, acquire them positions in office, etc. Opposition build their case around the role of the state in protecting individual agency. The state, therefore, for them, should not have a control over how people manage their property. So it was essentially a debate on whether or not what is the role of the state in relative to the resources of individuals. The Gov took this because in arguing inheritance is fictional and it is a function of birth lottery, this was in PM, it showed how the ability of individuals to practice agency is limited to the rich or to a limited few. This necessarily justified, therefore, why state intervention is a necessity, given both houses agreed that socioeconomic disparity should be addressed. DPM argued that agency cannot be violated once a person is dead, and GovWhip also showed that now how the harm on agency is also symmetrical in OPS model. So in the second point, the government was able to at least provide a response or engage with the principle of agency, arguing that it's limited, and in the case of DPM, it's not necessarily applicable. Although I would say that this is weak, this is a preferable alternative as to the argument of opposition. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the last is, well, will this stagnate the economy? And I would say that this is the thinnest in terms of contribution to the whole debate, because I would say that perhaps it's limited to only one speaker in one side. However, it's still credited because it was important in the debate. Gov argued that inheritance impedes economic growth because wealth is hoarded. This wealth is better off redistributed. They also argued that the rich are inherently selfish and have no incentive to help society. The state at least can be held accountable. So for them, what for them looks like a healthy economy is an equitable economy, such that for them it's harmful for status quo to exist, to still continue, because the rich they characterize the rich as inherently selfish and have no incentive to help society. Op argued that the rich will lose incentives. So for them, Op argued that the rich will lose incentive to work hard because they cannot pass their wealth to their children, which will impede economic growth. So for them, the logic is because rich individuals now, or specific individuals cannot pass their wealth anymore, they have no incentive to accumulate wealth and be productive in the economy, such that it will help the economy to grow. However, in this issue, still it is clear that government took this. Firstly, because government argued that the rich are likely to be complacent due to a secure future that inheritance offers. So this was provided by both, I think, PM and GovWhip, which deadlocked the incentive to work argument of opposition. So essentially, it deadlocked the standing point of opposition. Conversely, the argument of hoarding wealth still stood towards the end of the debate. Moreover, even though I would say that they had different definitions of what for them is healthy economy, it still tied both houses still tied back to the original goal of the debate, which is to eliminate that socioeconomic disparity. So for all intents, so that's it. The decision stands. Okay, thank you. So I guess I'll pass now to other members of the Adj.
So hi everyone. So the next part of the discussion will talk about the speaker scores, the range that was reflective of the round, and why we thought that was the case. So this is the range that we will be using for the entire duration of the tournament. So we want judges to download this in your devices so that you can continue to use this as a reference every single round that you will be grading people, so that we hope that it will be reflective of this, because one of the things we did notice during the exam was that a lot of the grades that people gave, well, most of them were like too high for the range we perceived the round to be using this particular guide. But given that, we can now start with a comparison or the explanation of the actual range. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first comparison would be prime minister versus leader of opposition. So this is how the flow of the discussion will go. First, I'll compare the two speakers, what their burdens are supposedly in the round, and why we felt that one speaker had to get higher grades or a higher set of range than the other speaker. And then I'll discuss the individual speaker and why we felt that they fulfilled the criteria for the particular range we scored them in. So for prime minister and leader of opposition, essentially, as first speakers of the round, their burden is to provide the important context where the debate lies. So the current problem, or is it there or is there not a problem, their models and the effectiveness of those models, as well as providing initial arguments for their sides of the house. And this is where we thought that prime minister had to get higher grades than leader of opposition, because we think that in terms of the burdens that I mentioned earlier, prime minister did provide an extensive discussion of the current context where society is in terms of wealth disparity, examples of how it manifests, such as the rich getting richer and the poor having a lot of barriers before they can climb the socioeconomic ladder. Also, we thought that prime minister had more attempts to explain how their model will work. So they talked about how they're going to ban all forms of intergenerational wealth. And then all the money that they're getting from that, they will redistribute in society. So in terms of project, in terms of aid, etc. And while LO, on the other hand, did agree that these kinds of problems exist, we thought that there wasn't as much substantiation as to how their model will, number one, look or work, and how will that model compare to government's model, where essentially they are also distributing or redistributing um, this money or these properties. And also, more than that, we think that leader of opposition is the first responsive speaker in the debate. And we think that while there were some attempts to respond in the round, we think that at best, those responses did not provide even if analysis. And at the same time, we thought that the bulk of the discussion of prime minister was about the individuals, why individuals don't have a right to inheritance, and we think that that bulk of analysis was not as responded to. But then I'll talk more about that on the individual part. So let's go to prime minister. So for prime minister, we gave the range of 75 to 77. What constitutes a 75, so average to slightly above average, or 77? So if you go back to the range for 75, the arguments have to be sufficient arguments were provided and explained to be adequately compelling. So there are contributions, and those contributions were substantiated with proper grounding and proof of importance. And generally, the case is logical and sound. But for it to become slightly above average, which is 77, it should be highly comparative, and there needs to be a proving of relevance of the case to the entirety of the debate. So we think that in terms of sufficient substantiation, wait, anyway, sorry guys. So for prime minister, we thought that there were sufficient substantiation given to the arguments presented in the round. So, for example, on the principle of why individuals do not have a right to inheritance, so they had multiple layers of analysis as to why this is a result of privilege and this leads to more wealth saturation, and how many things are out of your control as an individual who's underprivileged. So, the myth or the idea of hard work is something that's probably not applicable to you, and how it might result to more wealth disparity. And we think that beyond substantiating their claims, they were also able to prove the relevance of the claims to the round when they talked about how these apparent harms makes the policy more urgent, since the policy requires us to create a drastic change in the hopes of making the socioeconomic inequality or disparity lesser, or to a lesser degree. But also, we thought that there were a lot of attempts to compare even at the start of the speech when they tried to have preemptions in the round, when they talked about how regardless if it's a bad or good government, if it's a bad government, then all the more that we have to create drastic measures, or how we can vote them out anyway, or how if it is a good government, then it just follows as well that the trajectory we want to have is helping these people more, and we can better do that through redistribution. But at the same time, we felt like we could not give a score higher than 77, because we thought that at the same time they could provide a more extensive comparative on the converse of all the harms that they said were present in opposition side. So when they talked about how there will be wealth saturation, wealth disparity, and essentially more harms to the poor, while it was substantiated how those things will happen in op, at the same time, we would have appreciated if there was a more extensive comparative of the converse on why those things are most likely going to disappear or lessen in government's model. And then for leader of opposition, we gave the range of 73 to 75. So for this, arguments were present but lacked substantiation. There were arguments that were forwarded and had a slight degree of relevance. There were attempts to respond but missed important points, or even went to the degree of misrepresenting opponent's case. And then up to 75, like I said earlier, there were sufficient arguments, or there were attempts to explain the importance of the arguments. So let's go to like the 73 end of the range. So the reason why we thought that it was still possible to grade this person 73, because we did think that there were a lot of claims or a lot of contributions in the round that was not substantiated. So, for example, the idea on the principle of why individuals should have agency at all times in terms of their property, or just agency in general. So, we were still asking the questions of why, if they say that the state should only be the facilitator and not the direct controller of these kinds of properties, we thought it lacked substantiation on why should that always be the case, or why that will be good for the model, or even the idea that rich people will just exploit their resources instead of it going to the poor. We were still waiting for the likelihoods or the process of this argument, especially given the characterization of government presented in the round as to how on their side, they're more likely going to curb the behavior of these individuals. But at the same time, we were also willing to give this person to the grade of until 75, because we did think that there were contributions presented in the round that were logically sound and had attempts to substantiate more. So, for example, the idea of how the redistribution in government may harm the poor. So they talked about how if we continuously give the redistribution to them, then they may be viewed as leeches, as said by leader of opposition, and that those taxes on their side of the house anyway might go to the poor if they apply progressive taxation. So we did think that there were attempts to be able to present not only logical but important argumentation in the round. But the reason why we cannot go beyond the scores we gave was because we thought that there were a lot of comparatives missing in the round. So like first, like in terms of the model, it was not clear to us what makes progressive taxation better than redistribution in terms of mechanisms, or even like the weighing of values as to why, if it was true that poor people in government's model will be viewed as leeches, why is that still worse than them not receiving help, or not receiving money, which was the promise of government in the round. So those are the reasons why these are the scores and the range of the scores that we gave for the first exchange. So now we can go to the next exchange in the round, which is the exchange of deputies. So for the deputies, generally the burdens are to respond and then provide elevation or new material. So from the previous judge briefings, we did say that new material in the round can count as a form of responses or arguments, and to continuously build those new materials and prove their relevance. So for this exchange, the reason why we did feel that it deputy prime minister should get a higher range of grades from deputy leader of opposition was because we thought that um first, in terms of responses, there were not enough. In terms of responses, we thought that deputy leader of opposition did not directly engage the arguments that they said they were going to respond to. So it's not as targeted, and at the same time, it's not as substantiated. So they talked about as a response to the idea that rich people will be complacent in opposition. They said that, oh, but anyway, in your model, you're going to increase the stigma of the poor, or how when they talked about in government, how these kinds of properties or money will not be utilized as properly to stimulate the economy. They said in opposition from deputy leader of opposition that this is going to be addressed by their policy, but it wasn't as substantiated as to how exactly this will be addressed by the policy. Compared to deputy prime minister, we think that there were more attempts to provide an even if analysis to the responses to opposition. So they talked about how agency is not as important because even if we allow or give the rich more agency in opposition, this is likely going to lead to them exploiting resources or the poor more, because in status quo where the model of opposition lies, this is what happens. Or as a response, the anti-poor rhetoric, they said that it's okay because at least you get money that they can use for their needs. So we think that even if there were rooms for comparatives, at least there were attempts to provide more even if responses to the arguments of opposition. But more than the responses, also in terms of elevation, we think that there was a clearer and more substantiated elevation from deputy prime minister when they talked about how this might be bad for the economy because the money becomes stagnant or remains for the benefit of these rich families, versus the idea of like the harms for um from deputy leader of opposition. So we think that a lot of the harms that came from leader of opposition, so the lack of agency of the middle class or the anti-poor rhetoric of these individuals being viewed as leeches, we thought that a lot of the impacts of those argumentations were very similar to impacts that were already presented by a leader of opposition. So it was unclear to us where the delineation lied in these arguments. But then let's go to the individual scores or the range of the scores for these speakers. So for DPM, so the range of 72 to 74 says that arguments were presented, but like they lack substantiation. They did provide a slight degree of relevance. There were attempts to respond, but it missed a lot of important points. And the 74 range, they were less persuasive than the speakers before, and the arguments were provided, but there were attempts to explain the importance, but those attempts were not as fully fleshed out. So why did we give them this range? So first, in the attempt to respond and compare. So like I said earlier, I already proved why there were a lot of attempts to respond and compare in terms of rebuttals. But we think that in terms of the arguments provided in the round, they did provide an explanation of the degree of the relevance of the argument. So when they talked about how, oh, this might be bad for the economy, there were tiebacks presented as to why this argument is important because it focuses on the societal lens or societal perspective of the round, which not a lot of speakers have discussed yet in the round, right? But the reason why we're not willing to give the speaker higher scores than this is because while they were able to prove that their elevation was to a degree relevant, there were still a lot of substantive processes that we were waiting for, as for example, exactly as to how will the process of reinvestment happen conversely in government, or how do they incentivize these kind of things. But at the same time, they still had a lot of material that at the same time were also very similar to things that Prime Minister discussed, such as the unfair advantage you're giving to the rich if you continue to not curb their behavior. But now let's go to DLO. For DLO, the range is again, so there's 72, which is similar to the starting score point of Deputy Prime Minister. But the difference is we were also willing to grade this person starting from 70, because for 70, the standards is that arguments were severely underdeveloped and there were little to no responses or engagement, or even if they did, they were unable to prove the relevance of the arguments or responses they presented. So for the little to no responses or engagement, I already discussed earlier as to why that is the case in the rebuttals. But at the same time, in terms of the arguments being severely underdeveloped. So I already mentioned earlier how a lot of the impacts and process that came from DLO were things that we already heard from LO. But for the new things, or for the bits of analysis that we did think were exclusive, such as, oh, you create an interference to the autonomy, or like the middle class is severely harmed. While these things were bits and pieces that were new, we also thought that they were severely underdeveloped because it was still unclear to us until the point of the end of their speech what the degree of the harm to the middle class families are, why are they the most important actors in the debate, given the bulk of characterizations that already came from the first speakers. So that's the reason why this is the range for the deputy speakers. So for the last exchange, or for the last explanation, we have government whip and opposition whip. So the burdens of the whips in the round is to continue to respond, to break the deadlocks that were existing in the previous two exchanges, and also to tie back the contributions of their partner into bigger issues in the round, to for us as judges to see where they fall in the debate, or where their place is, and at the same time to weigh these benefits and to weigh these issues. So the reason why we thought government whip had to get a higher score, or a higher range than opposition whip, was because we did think that government whip provided a lot of targeted responses, which I will further discuss later for the individual scoring. And they also had a lot of attempts to weigh the values present in the round, versus we thought from opposition whip, what we did witness was a lot of repetition of contribution. So they did mention the benefits presented by the previous two speakers in the opposition bench, but at the same time, there wasn't an extensive comparison of why these contributions are still relevant or better vis-a-vis the different goals presented already at that point of the debate. But more on that later. So first, let's go to government whip. So for government whip, for the 74 to 75 range, these are scores that I already explained what constitutes them from the previous discussions. And the reason why we gave this range for government whip, because we did think that they were able to prove the importance of their responses. So we thought that when they talked about how progressive taxation is actually contradictory to the agency argument, because it shows that they're also willing to curb the agency of these individuals, or how the backlash will happen in both sides anyway, at least they have a standing benefit, or how it will not as heavily impact or hurt the middle class because the redistribution will benefit everyone. So we thought that the way that they prove the importance of these responses is they were able to show how it weakens the persuasiveness of the op model in its entirety, because they did show that there were a lot of inconsistencies to the principles that oppositions were fighting for in the round. And at the same time, they were able to prove that while opposition was presenting a lot of harms for their side, they were able to prove that these harms do not um, exist to a degree of harm that opposition was trying to push in the round. But more than the importance of responses, we also thought that government whip had a lot of attempts to be able to compare their converse in the round. So they talked about how in their side, the converse is that they lift the burden of the poor individuals to continuously work hard in a system that is against them through redistribution, through providing a more equal playing field or more equal distribution of benefits. And they also talked about how the rich individuals have an unfair advantage on both sides anyway. But then on their side, they were able to compare that, at least on their side, they're able to curb their behavior by making them give up a part of what they own. But the reason why we're not willing to give government whip a higher score than this is because we also think that beyond weakening the model of opposition in terms of their persuasiveness and inconsistencies, we thought that there was still more room for them to fully compare their model. So for example, on the issue of the backlash to the poor, we think that while they did say backlash will happen on both sides, we thought that there was still more room to compare why that backlash is probably lesser of a harm on their side, or even like progressive taxation, why at its best it's still not as important or still not as beneficial as redistribution. But for the last speaker on opposition whip, so this range I was also already able to discuss for the previous speakers in the round. And the reason why we did give opposition whip these scores is because we did agree that there were a lot of attempts to respond in the round, but those attempts largely missed a lot of the important points in the round. Specifically, we did notice that the way that opposition whip tried to respond in the round was to continue bringing up the positive contributions for their side from their side. So, for example, progressive taxation, the spectrum of wealth of individuals, that there are middle class people. We think that while they continue to bring that up, there was not a lot, if any, of a comparative as to how exactly are they different or how exactly are they better in terms of comparing it to redistribution in general, or how it will trickle down to the individuals. So we thought that in terms of responses, opposition whip did not fully harm or weaken government's model because they were lacking in terms of comparative, and to a certain extent they did appear dismissive because of a lack of provision of explicit denials or even ifs in their responses. But also in terms of contribution presented in the round, while I did say earlier that opposition whip was able to bring back the contributions of their partners in the round, we think that it further lacked substantiation in terms of where now, given all the contributions in the debate, where should we place these benefits or contributions? What issues do they fall into? And if they fall into these issues, why are they the most important goals or most important contributions in the round? So that's why ultimately we did feel like this was the range fitting for everyone in the round. And then for the reply, it's essentially the same justification of the average range that we did present earlier. We did apply the same range and the same standards. It's just that for opposition of it's just that for the replies, of course, you have to just divide it by 2 and then you come up with these scores. So that's it for the speaker scores and why we gave them these scores and the range and how you can apply it on the next rounds for PIDC. So I'm gonna turn it over to Mikol.
Hello, everyone. Am I heard?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. So good evening, everyone. Thank you, Tris, Tony, and Nico. So now we'll be proceeding with the last part of this session, which is all about the common pitfalls and observations that we saw in judging, and then the relevant announcements of the shadow Adj score and reminders for appeals. Right. So let's first start off with our common observations. So general observations in the submissions that we graded. So there are 3. First is on speaker role. So generally, some members of the community noticed in previous local tournaments that judges tend to have a first speaker bias. And we were able to factualize that in the Adj test in this PIDC, or at least it reflects in the judge pool of this PIDC. So we just want to note and flag it here that we notice a lot of judges over-crediting second speakers or responsive speakers at the expense of first speakers. So what we just want to note here is that setting up the debate, being able to lay out the contextualization, the problem, the model, and all the other things that first speakers do is as important as the ability of the latter speakers to be able to engage in the round. So we know that a lot of judges tend to look at engagement as a standard for assessing the debate and giving speaks. But we just want to stress the importance that these first speakers do in the round. So please judge consciously and assess the speech consciously not just in relation to the entire debate, which is a very good thing to do, but also in relation to the expectations and burdens that the speakers have. So for instance, first speakers, or at least the prime minister, prime ministers do not have the ability to be able to respond, right? Like they can only make their case as robust or as robust or as preemptive, right? But do not undercredit first speakers just because there's a general low appreciation of their ability to be able to properly set up the debate. So there are some debates that which you might have watched previously, either in other tournaments or in your training sessions, where the first speakers spend a lot of time in setting the round because they feel that that's what's needed, being able to properly set the parameters of debate, and that's fine because it is within their burden and responsibility to do so. If they're able to do that and makes the debate, a lot clearer, a lot cleaner, then it is something that we need, something we have to appreciate first speakers for. The second common pitfall or observation that we saw was that there's also a tendency for judges to homogenize issues. And what do we mean by this? So it's almost as if judges always make the issues of the debate as a principal issue, the first issue, and the pragmatic issue as the second issue. But I think, and we felt like there is still an opportunity for judges to be a bit more specific in terms of the metrics that they'll be using. So you can and you are encouraged to be explicit about the standards that you're going to use and integrate it with the issues when you are discussing the issues. Or you can also be more specific and be more specific / be more granular with the issues that you want to discuss. So for instance, in this particular debate, it would be better if you don't just label your issues as just maybe a principal issue and a pragmatic issue, but be more specific. Like you could talk about the principle as meaning what is the interest of the state in this particular situation, or when you talk about the pragmatic issue, be more specific about discussing about the welfare of the poor. Generally, how do you generally improve the situation of the poor and things like that. So there is generally an opportunity there for judges to interplay specific metrics, clearer metrics that debaters would understand when you discuss the issues, rather than just plainly discussing it or plainly dividing your issues and judging the debate based on a principle and a pragmatic sense. In addition to that, a final note in this one, there are also a lot of instances where you will be judging issues which have an interplay of both a principal contribution and also a pragmatic contribution in a particular issue, and you being able to distinguish that, or you being able to make metrics a bit more specific and a bit clearer, allows your oral adjudication to be quite richer as well, rather than just purely dividing the debate into like a principle and pragmatic manner. So for instance, in this particular debate, there is a big discussion about the poor, and the principal discussion there could be about the narrative or treatment about the poor. And there could also be a pragmatic contribution there about the emancipation of the poor, or making sure that we give welfare to the poor, right? So generally there's that. And then the last note that we want to stress here is about overcrediting the speakers. So as Tris mentioned earlier, we have, the 67 to 83 range for judges to use, and we want you to use it consciously and very, very judiciously. We are okay with giving high grades and high above average ranges if the speakers and if the debate round deserves to be graded as such. But at the same time, we also want judges to be conscious of the standards in giving speakers, in giving speaks, in giving generally the range and the quality of the round. So we want you guys to always be mindful of that, to assess the quality of the contributions of these speakers. So we understand that everyone wants to be good, and you want to reward debaters, like very high scores. But yeah, you are there. You are appointed as a chair or as a judge of that particular room, because we see you fit to be able to properly assess the quality of the round, and that means being able to properly give guidance in terms of the right range, and they communicate that in the adjudication as well. And lastly, in relation to using the range, is we just advise debaters and everyone in the tournament in general to be honest about giving feedback, not just to debaters but also to adjudicators as well. Be honest about the quality of the round and the range that you used if you decide to mention it in your OA. So we notice in some of the test submissions that we checked that there was a mention of the quality of the round in the earlier parts of their adjudication speeches. And there's quite some discrepancies in terms of the judges saying that in the OA that they felt that it was an above average round, but the speaks do not necessarily reflect that. So number one, please understand the range. 74 to 76 is generally average. Higher than that is above average, and lower than that is below average. So that's one. We want you to be very, very familiar with the range. And if you're not, and then number two, we just want you to be honest, right? Because you don't want to give this false sense to the speakers just to appease them and just, to make them give you like a higher grade as well. It doesn't work that way, but it shouldn't work that way. So it goes both judges and debaters. So be honest with the feedback or with the quality. You don't have to reveal the scores, the actual scores, but being honest about the range or being honest about the quality of the speech, the quality of the round, the quality of the OA for debaters giving feedback to judges will be generally helpful for everyone in the tournament. So yep, those are the common observations that we saw in the Adj exam. So now we will go to the another awaited part of this session, which is the announcement of the Shadow Adj Corps. So we just want to first discuss the Shadow Adj Corps in principle. The appointment of the Shadow Adj Corps is a form of a checks and balance mechanism placed generally in major tournaments to ensure that different judging styles and perspectives are duly evaluated. So we understand that as the adjudication corps, we might have, or at least in this particular debate, we have a unanimous view of who won the round. But even amongst us, there is still different appreciations of the quality of the round, hence the range that Chris gave earlier in the speaks. And while we recognize that there might be some other perspectives that could be valid that are valid as well. We are appointing judges to be part of the Shadow Adjudication Corps to allow the other participants to appeal to them their grades. Okay, let me just plug in my computer. There. Right. So for this edition of PIDC, the Adj Corps will be appointed. So we have already appointed 4 members of the Shadow Adjudication Corps representing the top scorers in the Adj exam. So considering the size of the size of the judge pool of the tournament, we decided to increase from the usual two or three to four, so that all the judge participants will have, like, opportunity to appeal if they want to, and the members of the shadow Adj score won't be as swamped as they could have been if they're only like two or three. So the shadow Adj score is allowed to hear judge test score appeals from participants, and they have the ability to increase their scores by 0.5 or 1 point, and only to a maximum of 1 point. So what I want to stress here is that the shadow Adj score members can increase the score, but cannot decrease the score given by the Adj score to the judges. To the judges. So they can only increase the scores. Right. So with that, we are happy to share the appointment of the following judges as members of the Shadow Adjudication Corps. One is Joseph Lorendo, who scored 8.5. Second is Carlo Castillo, who scored 8.38. Third is Ichiro Arbole, who scored 8. And fourth is Kenji Tate, who scored 7.92. So congratulations to these four adjudicators for your appointment. And we want to flag here a special mention to Pratik, who scored the highest in the judge exam with a score of 8.91, but they won't be able to join the Shadow Adj score because of personal reasons. So please take note of these people. Other judge participants can appeal to the Shadow Adj score members their judge test scores. So now, the next thing that I will do is to discuss the appeals process. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, judge participants have the chance to appeal their scores to the members of the Shadow Adj score, and this is how we will go about it. Generally, the organizing committee will send an email about this process, about the details of the Shadow Adj score and all these instructions as well, but we just want to flag it here also. So judge participants will have to send an email asking for an appeal with their oral adjudication attached. So needless to say, only the test debate portion and only the oral adjudication portion, not the objective part and not the ballot part, can be appealed. So the judge participants have to initiate that email, and they have to CC all members of the adjudication corps. The organizing committee will be sharing our emails with you as well through their official communications, and CC the OrgCom email as well. So this is just to ensure that the appeal is visible, considering that we're doing this online. So we just want to be sure that everyone is generally aligned to what's happening with the appeals process. A note is that the judge may not send their appeal to a Shadow Adj score belonging to their own institution or they are conflicted with. So if I'm not mistaken, the members of the Shadow Adjudication Corps are from Ateneo, De La Salle, and UPLB. So judges from those other judge participants from those institutions have to send to other members of the Shadow Adj Corps belonging to other institutions. Or if you are conflicted with that particular Shadow Adj score member, then, you have to send your appeal to another member of the Shadow Adj score. The deadline for submission of appeals is by 12 noon tomorrow, July 29, 2021. This is to give us ample time. This is to give the Shadow Adj score members ample time to decide by themselves, deliberate, and give their final recommendations. So if in case some members of your contingent aren't watching, tell them this particular process. The second reminder is that the Shadow Adjudication Corps members will have to revert their recommendation by 12 noon of July 30th. So that's day one of PIDC. And the recommendation can either be additional 0.5 points, additional 1 point, or no increase at all. And the Shadow Adj score will have to reply to everyone. Generally, the judge participant, the members of the Adj score, and the organizing committee. Yeah, and then as a final note, appeals made beyond the deadline will not be entertained. So if you emailed beyond 12 noon of tomorrow, the OrgCom and the Adj score will have visibility on the timestamp anyway. We will not be able to entertain your appeal. and then the recommendation of the shadow ad score, their decision whether to add or not add, is final and irrevocable. Okay, so that's the appeals process. So just final reminders for judges before the tournament. So generally for the judging panel, we mandate the chairs to announce the decision of the round before anyone gives an OA. So this is just to have an easier flow and a much lighter flow on part of the debaters, so that they don't have to wait for 3 judges to speak before they know the results. And then for order of doing the OA, so just a reminder, minority judges should give their OAs first, followed by the majority. And then the general order of doing the OAs, trainees will go first, followed by panelists and chairs. So in case the chair is in the minority, they should give the OA first. Right. So these are just the reminders that we have. In case we have any other announcement, we'll be able to announce it before the first round by Friday. We are very, very excited to see you in the first ever online installment of Nationals. That concludes the judge test discussion part on behalf of the adjudication course. So again, on behalf of all of us, Chris, Tony, Nico, and Marina, thank you very much. See you on Friday. I'll turn you over to the organizing committee in case they have any other announcements. Thank you and good night, everyone.
So yeah, we'd like to thank the adjudication core for delivering the discussion on the adjudication exam. So just a couple more reminders before PIDC. Very important, please submit the tab confirmation form as soon as possible. And the deadline for that will be July 29th, tomorrow at 11:59 p.m. If you do not submit this on time, you will possibly not be allocated for the first round on July 30th until you answer the form. So again, please answer the form. Otherwise, we will not allocate you and take it as a sign that you are not participating in the tournament, to ensure that each and every team member in your team answers it, as well as the judges, because otherwise you will not be allocated for the first round until you answer the form. So that's pretty much it. If you guys have any questions, you can reach out to us through our email, officialpidc@gmail.com, and you can also message us through the InstiReps GC. And yeah, so we have just basically 2 more days until PIDC, and we'll see you then.